Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the kind of second webinar in our model risk management series for today. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right and can see some of the panelists we've got on the screen there. If anyone has any trouble, please do send a message through onto the chat message, and someone will be able to kind of help out with any of the kind of technical issues we might have here. I guess following on from Tony, what he covered last week, this is again the sort of second session that we're looking to run, mainly based around the questions that we have been asked by a number of our prospects, a number of our clients around the kind of model risk and EUC risk kind of area. So we've tried to dive into kind of what you, the audience, is interested in hearing about. And to the best of our abilities, we'll try and add a bit of unique insight from across the board. We've obviously got kind of 3 and 4 if Henry would like to also chime in on the panel today. I guess one thing that may well be a challenge for us, but I guess we can give it a go, is that the aim of this session was to really be a roundtable, obviously with COVID and what's happening there. A roundtable, strictly with 6 people indoors from Monday is not going to be possible. So, whilst there are people talking and having a conversation, audience engagement is very much encouraged. We're not going to pick on anyone, but I'm hoping Chris and Mark and others that are hopefully in the audience will be happy to chime in. But yeah, this is really a conversation and really for something for everyone in the audience to get a benefit out of as much as anything else. So without further ado, we'll kind of move on to the speakers we have, and hopefully my screen will update. So very quickly introduce myself. So Alex Subarow, I'm from Mitratech, previously Cluster 7. I'll be chairing today and kind of helping facilitate the conversations that we've got around the kind of topic for today. My background is really, I sort of spent 9 years at Cluster 7 before the acquisition by Mitratech, and here really to support everyone else. I guess next on the list, Charles, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I head up the electronic trading risk management practice within GreySpark. Been with GreySpark for about 10 years, pretty much the entire lifespan of GreySpark. We, as a practice, we're very much geared and build experience around electronic trading, and therefore utilizing that understanding and experience help banks to basically deal with impacts on regulatory changes, as obvious one, compliance needs, as well as the system technology architecture. We understand and have a full breadth of awareness of the technologies available on the market, fintech having beneficial impact on that area, as well as this subject model risk is a relatively new area for us, but we've got our hands dirty on some tricky situations and difficult challenges which we hope to share.
Fantastic, thanks Charles. Gian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, so I'm a senior consultant in Charles's team, so the electronic trading risk management practice. I've specialized in model risk management. So I've helped multiple clients on numerous types of projects, helping them define their processes and tools to support the model risk management lifecycle.
Fantastic. And finally, Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Ben Clayton from Bank Leumi. I'm the head of risk. So from a second line perspective, I'm responsible for maintaining the frameworks and challenging risk owners from a second line perspective, and model risk management, which I see as an enterprise risk, forms part of that risk domain that I challenge and look after.
Fantastic, thank you. Henry, do you want to be introduced or do you want to stay in the background?
No, I'll just quickly introduce myself. Apologies, yes, an accidental panelist joined using the wrong link. But for my sins, like Alex, I was at Cluster 7 for over 12 years, latterly the CEO. So a lot of our clients are using our technologies to help with both the EUC and model space. So I will try and sit quietly, but chip in and hopefully provide some challenge to Jean, Charles, and Ben, and trying to keep the conversation going. But thank you.
Great, thanks, Henry. So moving on into, I guess, what everyone is here to discuss. We've got a couple of kind of high-level questions that we wanted to cover off today. Again, as we mentioned, sort of based loosely on sort of what questions we went out and asked our clients. The first one around the kind of model versus EUC, we're probably going to spend kind of 10-15 minutes on that one. As I said, people feel welcome to kind of raise a hand or put a kind of question in the chat, and we can pick those up. And then the second one is obviously going to be a bit more involved in the sort of COVID-19 impact around model risk. But to kick us off, without picking on anyone, Jan, would you like to start us off on your thoughts on kind of what a model is? You know, we're kind of taking it back to basics here. What's a model, and I guess how does that interlink with EUCs? And you know, it might be Charles that supports you on the EUC piece, but do you want to fire away on what a model is?
Sure. Thank you, Alex. So we're all familiar with the SR 11.7 definition of a model. As a reminder, I have it in front of me. I don't know it by heart, but SR 11.7 defines a model as a quantitative method, system, or approach that applies statistical, economic, financial, or mathematical theories, techniques, and assumptions to process input data into quantitative estimates. So this in mind, the general consensus is that if the tool's output contains uncertainty, it should be considered as a model. Applying that definition in practice has been challenging because there's no guideline on how to do it. What we are recommending and what we've seen as best practice is to move away from the strict definition of a model to take on a risk-based approach to model identification. So this means identifying a set of criteria which will identify those tools that will enter into the model risk management lifecycle. So, for example, at identification stage, you could look at a tool's complexity, materiality, prevalence to classify it or not as a model. Looking at the combination of those criteria should help you determine whether, based on your firm's policies, is this a model or not. And when I say you can look at complexity, materiality, and prevalence, you could also decide that even if a model is not very complex, if it has a high prevalence, then it will be classified as a model. So that takes me to then what is an EUC, and I will then hand over to Charles, but EUCs are essentially just tools or spreadsheets, even Python programs, for example, that have been developed on an individual user's computer. And yeah, that's where the conversation between model vs EUC starts, as in where should EUCs be declared to model risk, and how to make sure that these EUCs are not actually models and don't present uncertainty.
Okay,
yeah,
fantastic. Sorry, Charles, as I say, have you got anything else to add on top of that?
Yeah, so I just want to kind of add so yeah, thank you, Jan. So Jan talked quite a lot about the specifics, which also then therefore form the challenges. So what I want to do is add some color to that to kind of hopefully kind of show a sense of the experience we have, real life, kind of practical problems. So some of the work that we've done to help banks handle this process of especially a lot of the talk is initially about how do we perform this model identification process, how can we make it a lot more robust so that you have this funnel and you have these EUCs, models, algos, and then decide which parts need to come under scrutiny, come under the MRM scrutiny, the SR 11.7 scrutiny, so that they can do their assessments, essentially the second line. And that is largely understood that needs to be done. I think what it is, the challenge comes and the tension comes from what we discussed earlier, is around you have these different elements within a bank. You have the second line, you have the business, you have the algo IT teams. They're all developing their assets and they're all starting to interconnect. And then therefore it creates, from an MRM point of view, their compliance team, suddenly their bucket of assets that comes under scrutiny gets bigger. And it becomes a sheer volume problem where you have, where do you start, where do you stop? Is therefore the model identification process sufficiently mature to handle this huge volume of EUCs as well? And then so they normally come to us and say, how can we rebuild our decision-making process? Or so we have this kind of notion of, first we have to identify a model and then decide, okay, if that is definitely a model, and then there's a lot of issues about what is a model, what is not a model, is it an EUC or model or not, then the decision-making process is not actually about, is this a model or not? It's more about, okay, evaluating the degree of risk. And so a lot of work.
Yeah, so you're looking more at, is it not is this a model, is it like, what's the impact of the organization here, and looking more holistically around how that kind of would have an impact.
Yeah.
I mean, Ben, from your perspective, I don't know if this is a consistent thing that you guys do at Bank Leumi in terms of the way you define a model, or if you guys take a slightly different approach to that.
No, thank you, Alex. I echo Gian's viewpoints in that it almost doesn't matter what you call a model or how you differentiate a model and an EUC.
Yeah.
To take a very specific and practical application, how we've applied it locally, I have a model risk tiering scorecard, and actually a model that is dependent or has a precedent from an EUC is actually a risk multiplication factor. So, and this echoes with some of the conversations I've had with the regulator, in that they're relatively agnostic as to, you know, whether it's a model, whether it's an EUC, what are the risks, what are the governance being deployed to ensure that boards and senior management understand what is the variability within these tools, let's call them that, and how are you managing risks. So I'm relatively agnostic on the semantics as to whether it's a model or an EUC. I note, of course, that SR11 has provided a prescribed definition, PRA being the PRA have not, and that, I think that alludes to they don't particularly care what's an EUC or what is a model. You need to classify it and employ the appropriate governance and documentation, etc., etc. But what are the risks?
Yeah, so there's really continues to be that grey area that exists between the model and EUC space, and actually for an organisation, what you're saying is, as long as they've gone through the kind of steps to potentially recognise those differences, whether it's an EUC or a model actually doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think it's almost like we need to move away from this binary distinction, yes or no. It's actually, that's the bit that catches people up all the time. They're looking for that very simple yes or no. No, that's not the approach, basically.
Yeah, so I mean, coming on to the second bullet point there, then, does that almost rule that out as something that is not important, or is the very fact that maybe the controls that are often required on a model perspective could be increased compared to an EUC, that you know users would prefer not to have those put in that bucket? I don't know if Jan, if that's something, you know, in terms of how we prevent it, and how, you know, more from an organizational perspective, whilst there is that grey area, how would you implement something like this practically?
I think in general, the question, what's a model vs an EUC, matters still today, although I agree with Ben and Charles that, you know, it should almost not be a question, but the reality is that today, and Charles mentioned earlier, that a lot of stakeholders are involved in the MRM process, and it's our experience talking with various banks that they still rely on not definitions, but the stakeholders still want to know what to do with the tool that they have in front of them. They know that if it's an EUC, if it's classified as an EUC, then it won't have to go through the model risk management lifecycle, which is a plus. So I think the question is still relevant. Now, what's important though is to have all stakeholders aligned on what to do with these tools based on their risk level, because that's the approach that we're trying to take, is a risk approach. What's important for them to do, for firms to have, is to educate stakeholders on the firm's policy definition, if there is one, an approach towards a model versus an EUC. There should also be constant conversations between MRM and the different business areas that could use EUCs and models. That could take the place of forums, for example, regular meetings, and in general, that should also enable the firm to raise awareness around the discussion models versus EUC. There's also conformance assessments that can be done. That is MRM reaching out to anyone in the bank that could have models potentially, and requiring them to attest that they are using or not models, again, to raise awareness. Obviously you can't, if someone doesn't want to declare their EUCs as models at all, there's nothing you can do. But that should also, doing that should also enable to raise awareness.
Okay. Sorry, Charles, I heard of you about to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add, it's actually what Jan earlier pointed about, this kind of, there's this perception that we've seen with banks where they're developing some Python tool, EUC spreadsheet, whatever, and there's this question in their head: if I declare this as a model, I'm going to be subject to a lot of work. And there's this perception of, I don't want that. They make that decision themselves to say, oh, actually, what I'm producing is really harmless. It has no impact. So the danger there is there's going to be a huge potential big black market of EUC components, very simple calculation tools that is totally hidden from sight, that is actually increasing in size, potentially building up risk that's not perceived anywhere. And so we need to kind of tackle that human perception of that concern, where actually they feel it's actually beneficial for them to declare because the process is relatively simple, but then their belief is that they are protected when they declare.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe a question for you then, Ben, based off that. Is there an argument to say that the model policy and the EUC policy should be one, and that an EUC is simply a tier of a model, or is that complete overkill? And I don't know, is that something that you guys at Bank Leumi have looked at, or is that still the difficult question? You know, the one that people don't quite know how to approach based on what Jan mentioned around the additional requirements around models.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer your point, and I'll make an observation on the comments that were made previously. So we do differentiate. We do have an EUC policy. We do have a model risk management framework. They speak to each other. They're not inconsistent with each other, but we do differentiate between an EUC and a model. And clearly, there's different levels of operational requirements and oversight. So an EUC, of course, doesn't get board attention. A model does, or the decisions that go into that and the management assumptions that surround that do get board level oversight. So I sympathise to an extent as to the differing level of both operational requirements and governance requirements between the two. But from a tier 3 bank perspective, we do differentiate. Just to pick up on the previous comments, I understand the I guess the human motivation to prefer that. To classify your tool as an EUC rather than a model for the aforementioned reasons. But I think, let's take a little bit of a step out of this. Let's this stress testing framework, this model risk management framework has been born out of the last couple of years. And there's been a lot of activity in the regulatory space. And what I'm particularly referring to is the senior management regime, or at least SC1 for a C-suite or a senior manager or material risk taker, is that they need to take reasonable steps to ensure that the business is appropriately controlled. So I would be concerned if I was in those organisations at the C-suite level that there was this sort of hidden black box of ungoverned tools that I don't have effective oversight or control of. So just bringing in an element that, yes, I understand the motivation from an operational level and from a non-senior manager level to not declare these as models. However, if I was at the C-suite level in those organisations, I'd be very concerned that that was the case.
I mean, Alex, if I could just sort of dive in, I mean,
I was about to bring you in there, Henry, yeah, so please do carry on.
One observation, and probably Charles directed to you, is obviously there's a reasonable amount of maturity in the model risk on the trading side of the organisation. So the use of models, their benchmarking is a pretty well understood practice. I think what you described earlier in terms of the complexity, the connectivity, the availability of technology is challenging senior management in terms of, you know, when they ran the trading book, it was somewhat simpler, and therefore there are challenges. I think what we're seeing now is that model risk framework moving not just from the trading book but across the whole banking book and having a lot more attention, and that's causing a lot of, I mean, there's also a herd mentality. We've been over the last 20 years as technology come on. Admittedly, in the last few years, technology really is getting more and more. It enables us to do a lot more, and it is challenging the trading side of the book. And I think there's an implied question here. I think that the front office are being challenged more and being asked to be involved more in that model risk management framework than they were before. But I think on the other side of the house, on the trading, on the normal sort of banking book, this is relatively new. As Ben said, you know, we're starting to realise that decisions are being made by models, and you know, actually, frankly, there's a quite much larger part of most people's organisations where there isn't that maturity, and therefore, you know, we're trying to implement, in some people's eyes, a very you know, a well understood model risk management in an area that really doesn't understand it. So there's quite a number of dynamics here, which I think, if you get down 10,000 feet, start to challenge organisations quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I totally agree with that. I've seen also kind of a nugget of this, which is, as I mentioned before, a lot of the work we do is also algo trading. And there's always been this kind of them and us situation where the business who own the algo trading technology, who then suddenly have MRM, the compliance team, imposing processes on them to kind of surface algos that have this mapping to map models. And what we notice is the first thing is that the business algo trading teams and the traders front office always say, well, you don't understand our business, you don't understand our technology, you don't understand the kind of responsibility we have. We are the revenue generator of the bank, and therefore you cannot hamper or hold us back with the development of algos, because that's essentially negating being on market on time. Yeah. With whatever strategy they build. The key thing that seems to pop out is, if we have to take an algo because it has a model component in there through this MRM life cycle, that would take 6 months. By that time, there's no point taking this strategy into the market. So these are the arguments that we get. It is a little bit of initially education between the two lines of defense, the business wanting us to help MRM understand their challenges, vice versa, the other way around as well. MRM have a responsibility as well in terms of implementing the regulatory compliance they need to do across the bank. So there's a little bit of that. And then it's very much about one of the key kind of components that we've developed to help ease that is a transparency of the process between the two, which is, for example, building decision trees for taking whatever asset that needs to be evaluated or from a risk basis through a transparent decision-making process, but it's borne out by an agreement on how that process, how that decision-making tree looks like between the two. So it's very much, that's a sweet spot for us as an independent to come in to derive that based on understanding both sides, building the decision tree so that they are in agreement with it. Therefore, they're more likely to buy into that process. And then you tackle one, which is now they have a process that they can use to kind of essentially at the end of it, have multiple buckets of risks of models EUCs dropped in, and therefore a workflow that's connected from the back of it. It doesn't answer all the questions. There are still problems, but it does build a framework from which they can develop from that and improve upon that, mechanize it as much as possible to improve productivity as well. It provides the benefits of some EUC components can be easily classified as very, very low risk. Therefore, but that process of this classifying is very transparent so that the individuals on the desk can see how that is done. They're more willing to bring it up and declare the model, the EUC components.
Thanks, Charles. But Ben, I don't know if you've got anything to add there. I don't know how much Lumi get involved from the algo perspective. The question I had on this a little bit was that is there a scope to have maybe slightly different flavors of what model definitions are dependent on the department? So we talk about the front office probably is the outlier here. Would that be something that firstly the regulators might entertain, or whether that might be something senior management might look at?
I don't see, speaking both from my perspective but also from an industry perspective, I don't see there being a tiering of models and risk tiering of models very much so, and that's something that we've implemented locally at Lumi. Having slightly nuanced or different definitions as to what a model is, depending upon whether you're front office or you have an AMA approach for operational risk, I don't see that flying, to be honest. Not only from a regulatory perspective, but from a board level perspective. So I think it comes back to the risk. So if you have identified your models, I think you can differentiate between them on a risk-based basis, and your expectations as to the level of governance and operational requirements can be tailored accordingly. But I think that's quite a sort of a dangerous area to get into, to have multiple definitions of what a model is depending upon where you sit.
Yeah, I mean, I thought as much, but it's always interesting to get people, actually at the coalface in terms of maintaining that. And as you say, the minute you start to have lots of different definitions for lots of different departments and different areas, it's more things you have to maintain, more things you have to update. When the regulator in a certain jurisdiction changes what their thoughts are and that sort of stuff. We were sort of overrun on that question, but we were having some good discussion, so I didn't want to kick it off. We've got probably about a minute or so. Jean, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to close off with, or whether it's good for us to move into the into the next question around COVID.
Well, I guess the conclusion would be that if it really doesn't matter what the definition is. However, and I'm looking at the last question here. If something was classified as an EUC but does present model risk, or even if not model risk, if it presents if it has a high level of materiality, for example, it's not bad to make the EUC go through the model risk management lifecycle if it's needed. It doesn't have to be a very lengthy one. The tests done might be lighter than the ones usually done on models. However, it's never a bad thing to lower your risk, to mitigate your risk.
Sure. Great. And whilst you're speaking, and thank you for kind of closing off, do you want to kick us off then on the second question around the impact that COVID's had? I know this is a bit of a step change. We've kind of discussed what a model is. We're now getting more into actually the day-to-day model risk management that people are having to do, and how COVID has really kind of rewritten the rule book in some ways because of the nature of what it's done.
Yeah.
Kind of over to you to start us off.
Well, I guess the impact that COVID had is the assumptions that models used to rely on have changed. The data has changed, and sometimes does not even exist anymore, which poses the question of are the models still relevant? Should they be revalidated? Should they be recalibrated? Should they be discarded? And if that's the case, how to do it? Because if we go back to normal situations in a few months, how do we make sure that the new model that we created based on COVID-19 data is still relevant? And even that in itself is going to be, it would even be difficult to recalibrate models based on the new data, just because we actually don't have that much data to test our new models with if we were to build COVID-19 specific models. So what we've seen then is that some banks have decided to make some judgment calls on the results that they're receiving from outputs from models. Sorry, and yeah, it's difficult to then mitigate your risk and to avoid all errors when you're making judgment calls. And then the discussion is, if you're deciding to make judgment calls, how do you make sure that they're still in line with the firm's policy? So maybe that's having a new policy on the COVID-19, on how to react to COVID-19 data and weird outputs.
Yeah, no, as you say, it's a kind of a challenge that we haven't really come across, in our lifetimes, at least, around the kind of pandemic. Ben, I know we were talking beforehand on how kind of Bank Leumi is approaching this. Would you mind giving your inputs on how those sort of expert judgments have been handled throughout the pandemic with you?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's comments, I guess. Much of our discussions had focused on what's a model and an EUC and what is the appropriate risk management governance to apply between the two. So we're still sort of grappling with that PF 718 that's 2 years into the line. So to the extent to which you are having good conversations at the board level, I think their focus has now been taken away by COVID, and in particular, what is the impact on capital? What's happening to our ECL model? And specifically, what are the management overlays and assumptions that are impacting each stage of its development, if you like, or decision making, very much in beginning with your macroeconomic data forecasts and how you're applying those over the foreseeable future. So greater challenge, which is good, which is healthy, but we're still in this sort of grey area, and there's a significant reliance as to what the street is doing. There was an FT article not too long ago listing out a number of banks of what their ECL provisions were in Q2 this year, and it ranged from Credit Suisse being top of the pile to Handelsbanken actually writing down their provisions. So they're going through the appropriate governance, challenging management, and as to the assumptions that are being taken, but there is a great deal of comfort as to what the street is doing. How are your, in an ECL specific world, where are your percentage migrations at each credit grade relative to the street? So there's an element of good conversation, and then there's an element, well, what's the street doing? Let's not be an outlier.
Yeah, that's it. Don't go so far that you create an extra risk compared to the market, as you say. I mean, Charles, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, anything to add that we haven't covered off. I mean, in some regards, we're still fairly early days into the impact COVID-19 is having, and the uncertainties continue.
Yeah.
So is this something people are going to be dealing with for a couple of years to come, do we think?
I think that's actually the key point. Is this something people will be dealing with a couple of years to come. I would naturally say yes. From what we've seen, it's going to be something that they will have to deal for some time. So, you know, what Ben and as Jan talked about is the uncertainty of the market has created non-conversions of models because they weren't built around this, and it's very hard to build models to kind of essentially track the kind of disruptive on the markets, the capital allocations. And so what I want to kind of chime in with is less about that, but kind of the impact of COVID to model risk, but actually impact to essentially the operations in the bank who develop the models, what it means to them. So you have obviously changes in working practices. You have suddenly people no longer in the office. You lose this kind of direct link with people, tackling this kind of exception condition, which creates a problem in itself. And the way I see it is that one of the impacts and the subsequent lessons that need to be learned is very much more about how do we build in the bank much more resilience in its operations for model risk, for EUC, for that type of process, so that we are able to still respond and react efficiently, effectively when we face with disruptions like this. So what I'm thinking is that banks will be subject to all sorts of future disruptions. It's not may not be COVID, it may be something else. All right. And I think what this has taught us is that there is a question of resilience in a bank, resilience in operations, resilience in this process we're talking about. How do we make that a lot more robust? All right. How do we employ technology to help with that collaboration between people to actually allow for work to continue if people cannot be on site? But also there's benefits out of that as well, because there may be some simplification efficiencies in there that can be derived from that as well. And I think COVID has taught us, and in some ways I'm kind of diverging from model risk, but because it applies to many things, it taught us about some of the old practices that come out don't work in this situation. And it has become, I would say it's become harder than it would have been, I think, because of the fact people are dispersed, there's other things on people's minds and everything else. So it's much more about the human side of things. But also, I think I'm kind of leading on to one of the things that's happening around with PRA on a kind of up and coming regulation of operational resilience. It seems to come hand in hand to this. It's quite timely. And I think there's a few lessons there to be learned on that side of things to help, because at the end of the day, you know, we have people in the bank, we have the intelligence in the bank to handle these things, but they also need to operate effectively, collaboratively, improve that kind of awareness of processes, technologies that allow them to continue to be.
Yeah. I mean, Alex, if I can chime in, I think Charles is right. This has been the pandemic has been the ultimate test of our processes, the resilience. You know, so if you know, those banks that had Asian operations that went through SARS and things, they understood how to change their operations so that, you know, for example, you divided your FX desks up, so there was never a concentration of you suddenly lose your yen desk because they're all sitting together and they catch the virus. So they knew how to segment people in those offices. When you move it to model risk, really it goes back to what Ben says. If you've got a robust model risk program, then we built models, and maybe we did or did not anticipate a pandemic of this scale. But a robust model governance program is not necessarily at the highest level, is to go, okay, so we understand, because we understand the governance of models, which ones are going to fail, or which ones we will need to focus on, because we know they have shortcomings and we didn't anticipate this risk. So I think if you had, so I guess my view of the impact of this is like, how robust was our program to be able to deal with this pandemic? And so it's similar, Charles, to your thing about the ops resilience. From a model risk perspective, did we understand out of, let's say, a population of 200 models, it's these 5 that we need to concentrate on? What is the order we concentrate on? Because we had a robust governance in place. From the board down, we knew from day one, from whatever it was the end of March, these are the ones that we need to focus on, these are the ones we need to invest in, because then we know that we'll be solvent, we know how to protect our business. And that's what the program does. Eventually then, whether that feeds down into our algo traders or what we're doing in Singapore, on Simex, doesn't actually matter. It's at the high level is being able to give the board that view. And that's really what COVID has done to test us, is the resilience of those programs. And then all the tiering and making sure the appropriate things, and don't put the wrong tiering in because people hide them and all that stuff is well, it's very, very, very important, because you've got to create a program that, it's one thing you said, Charles, you've got to have it so people buy into it. If you don't buy into it, then the board will make the wrong decision. And it's really important getting that appropriate governance implemented from the top down, so that the firm can work symbiotically together. And especially when we're not sitting in the same offices together, how do I know what Alex is doing, or Ben is doing, or Charles is doing, or Jean's doing? And we don't know. We need to be able to have confidence in the decisions we're making.
Right. I don't know if anyone has any closing remarks on that point. I kind of feel like we've had some good inputs there. If anyone does, please speak now. Otherwise, I think it might be nice to move on to some final questions for the last sort of 5 minutes, and see if the audience have anything they would like to ask. So, are there any questions from the audience? I mean, people, please do feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. If we have no one jumping forward, I have one to ask, but we'll let the audience have a go first. Any questions? Okay, on that basis, while people are having a little think about some questions, this might be one for you to answer, Charles. You touched on the sort of algos piece there. I know we've talked about the sort of the understanding of the, really the way we handle models, EUCs, algos is from a risk perspective, and actually looking at what impact they have to the organization. Is there an argument to say that there should be a separate algo policy that treats algos differently, that has maybe a flavor of both EUCs and models, or whether they should continue to be banded with the sort of model policy and the model risk framework, because ultimately they are models, or is that sort of something that stymies the front office?
At the moment, there is, it's not an argument, it exists already. There is a separate policy.
Okay, well, there you
go. Are separate, and especially from historic reasons, and also regulation. A lot of the policies that will come across algo specific is because it's driven by regulations, because the regulations start off with MiFID 2, RTS 6. It's very much algo. It's therefore banks are naturally inclined to write policies around that. And we have done a fair few, so we kind of fed the fire. And we help them with RTS 6 self-assessments and everything else. So it's very much locked down to the algo space, and it's entrenched a little bit as well. It's well understood, it's mature, so we are at that state. There's a separate that has in some ways in itself created a little bit of a problem. The model risk element is clearly defined as separate. There is a separate regulation, although at the moment the only one that's really active is the US one. However, a lot of the banks who operate even European banks operate with, US securities and interests, business interests, will therefore abide by SR 11.7, and also therefore some banks will even use it as a best practice guidance to show that. So it's more like, I guess, as a consultant, we operate in the current reality. We're handling this. It's and sometimes I personally feel it's like we're trying to patch the two together, and it works initially fine. There was no major issue because the population of models interacting or coupling with algos were far and few, so it was manageable. However, talking to the regulations, talking to a large number of banks, a lot of the articles we've written are based on essentially investigations across them. We're noticing that there's an upward trend of more and more models interacting with algos. So it's put a lot of pressure on these policies, processes, procedures that operate in these two streams. And I believe, to be honest, my argument is that for now it's fine to keep it separate. The regulations demand such a degree of scrutiny and transparency and reporting that you need to have that. I think with senior management regimes, it needs to be clear to individuals in that responsible position what they are subject to and need to responsible to, and therefore will be penalized if they don't. They need to be clear what is that policy. We can't start mixing at this point. I don't know really, to be honest, how it pan out. It's very much about I think what it is that if I really want to complicate things, algos increasingly becoming utilizing AI technology and basically machine learning. They are models, all right. It complicates the area. It's definitely a work in progress.
Great, thank you, Charles. That's yeah. We have had a question in from the audience. Thank you for participating. This one kind of goes back to kind of more of the EUC side of things, and perhaps Jan or Ben, you might want to provide your feedback. So the question kind of comes in that it can be easy to use the term EUC to cover simple calculators, for instance, whereas in reality EUC tools that meet the definition of a model also kind of have that particular label. Does the challenge therefore lie in working out where to draw the line on the uncertainty that's introduced on those files? So whether it is an EUC, a model, or whatever it is, it's that uncertainty, that expert judgment that an organization needs to get a better handle on. Don't know.
Completely agree. That's where the risk is. So I think I've articulated previously, which is not misaligned with the regulatory expectations. They're agnostic pretty much as whether you call it an EUC or what is it doing, what decisions or what management overlays go into it, and at the end of it, its results, what management decisions are being taken. So it very much focuses on the risk of those, call it qualitative overlays.
Yeah, and a kind of another piece to the question, which I couldn't quite get down to reading, it was quite a nice lengthy one. Is the uncertainty introduced by the process, i.e. the expert judgment of like an input to a calculator, or is it introduced potentially by the expert judgment of the design or the workings, or is it arguably both? On that, Jan, I don't know if you want to.
I think it's both.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and then we haven't mentioned it before, I think, but this needs to be documented in a way that then can be used to evaluate whether this uncertainty will result in a number of testing and validation processes.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we are nearly at time, or thereabouts time. We sort of aim to do a sort of 45-minute session, so we've gone 5 minutes over, but the conversation kind of was flowing. If there are any more questions, now is your time to quickly kind of jump in. Otherwise, if unless anyone from the panel has any closing thoughts or things they'd like to say, I think this would be it for today, and hopefully we can see you all next week.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you everyone. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.